Okay, I would like to welcome everyone to the 7th in the series of lectures, shiurim, on the sections of the Guide for the Perplexed, the Moreh Nevuchim, on Negative Theology. And having spent quite an amount of time, I think 3 shiurim at least, maybe 2-3 shiurim on Parak Nun Dalet, it's now time to move on to chapter 55, Parak Nun Hey, and I'm in the Schwartz edition. I didn't bring the Peters edition with me today. In the Schwartz edition, on page 135, Parak Nun Hey. So the Rambam says, we've said several times in this work, certainly we have to reject any description of God, any physical description of God. Right? The shlo have to reject it completely. In other words, also too, we have to reject any action of God. Right? Because once it's an action, it implies there's a change in God. Notice if God walks or he breathes or he does anything like else, it means that there's a change. Right? And certainly, right, it's right, and without any doubt, that which causes the action is certainly right. It's certainly not him. And in other words, he's not being affected. If God is being acted upon by any specific act, so he's being changed. In other words, basically, there cannot be any change in God because he's being changed by something else. So that obviously is a contradiction to the assumption of God as actually being the cause of all things. In other words, any lack in God also has to be rejected. It can't be that God lacks something and after that has that thing. Right? For example, it can't be that God doesn't know something at one time and then knows it another time. In other words, if in fact we assume that, then he would be shalom only bekoach, only potentially be complete. God has to be perfect and complete, right? In Act 2. In other words, if we say God potentially is something, that means that in fact actually at one point he's missing something. Okay, so once again, the Rambam is saying is that with Bata Kodesh Baruch Hu, he cannot be lacking anything, he cannot have anything potentially. Okay? Okay? Now, in addition to, says the Rambam, that we cannot compare God to anything else. This is something that everybody knows. We see explicitly in the Nevi'im that the Nevi'im tell us that, in other words, the Kodesh Baruch Hu cannot be compared to anything. And quoting the Navi in Yeshayahu, to whom can you compare me to? Compare me to. What comparison, what analogy can you draw to God? There's nothing like you. Right? That's in Yirmiyahu. Okay? Says the Rambam, I brought 3 psukim, in fact 3 verses, but actually we find this throughout. Okay, now, klalo shel davar. In other words, basically, what is the Rambam doing in Parak Nun Hey? We've seen in previous chapters, the Rambam has dismissed descriptions of God, but it could possibly, you could have understood that what the Rambam was speaking about up to now, it seems to be that, in fact, that is what the Rambam was referring to, were physical descriptions of God. But here the Rambam is actually coming on to say that even more non-physical descriptions of God, right, also have to be negated. We cannot speak about a lack in God, we cannot compare God to anything. In other words, basically, God is indescribable not only physically, but in any sense of the word. Klal shel davahu, says the Rambam, the bottom line, the general rule, in other words, basically, one cannot refer to God, one has to reject, right, any reference to God in one of 4 ways. Number 1, any anything about God which suggests any material property has to be rejected. Number two, anything which is a change in God, anything which implies a change in God, that also has to be rejected. Number three, something which implies a lack in God. In other words, somehow God will be potentially something, and afterwards, in other words, he will be active. So a potential state implies that there's something lacking him actively, which is only expressed later on. Or four, there cannot be any analogy between God and anything in the creation. So in other words, basically the Rambam is rejecting any description of God at any level. In fact, there is total incommensurability between the Kadosh Baruch Hu and anything in the world. Okay, now, says the Rambam, right? Right? These are things, right, which are in the Chochmas HaTeva, the wisdom of nature, which come to help us in knowing God. Whoever doesn't know the sciences, and the science of nature, would not know that in an act there's something lacking in the act. I mean, there's a type of a change, or for example, a potential that goes to an active. In other words, basically it says, what the Rambam is saying is the following thing. In other words, if a person doesn't understand how to analyze nature, a person understands, for example, that, in other words, when something happens, usually that thing which happens is usually absent, is only potentially, and then active. For example, in other words, if I put a stone on top of something and I let go, so therefore there's kinetic energy, right? But when the stone was standing up, there was potential energy. So in other words, if I thoroughly understand that in fact actually the position of the stone here implies a lack. What's a lack? Because afterwards when the stone falls, there's kinetic energy. Therefore, the stone had potential energy, which is a lack of kinetic energy, given the conservation of energy. We're pre-Einsteinian physics. There's a conservation of energy. So in other words, a kinetic energy that comes afterwards only reveals a potential energy, which is a type of a lack. So the Rambam says if you understand physics, or if you understand motion, for example, what's the motion? Something will move only if something acts upon it. So for example, if something moves, that means the thing in and of itself changed as a result of something else acting on it. So that's also a chisaron, right? That's also something which is a lack. In other words, understanding the physical physics, the physics of the natural world helps us to understand how different phenomena, right, each have an intrinsic lack based upon the trajectory or based upon the development of an object within time. So therefore, the more I understand the natural world, the more I understand what cannot be attributed to God. Because God, not only can God have attributed to him the physical aspects of the world, he can have attributed any of the physics of the world. So in other words, basically what the Rambam is saying is that the last three categories that he mentions, which are in fact a lack in God that comes from motion, right? Or a lack of God that comes from something in potential, or a lack of God that comes from commensurability, right? Really come from observations of the physical nature of the world, which we're saying cannot be applied to God. In other words, the deeper one understands nature, then the higher is his conception of the monotheistic concept of a Kadosh Baruch Hu. That's what the Rambam is saying.
So any potential energy is a lack.
It's a lack, because it's a lack of what is potential energy. It means right now I lack this kinetic energy.
But, and after it's befoiled, there's also a lack, so no longer has the potential.
Right, but there's a big difference though. Once the thing falls, it already see that previously there was a lack. In other words,
that means that God can't have anything with potential because that would imply a lack in God.
Right. Okay? So, in other words, okay, now, in other words, a person doesn't understand the physics of the world. He doesn't understand that a potential state has an intrinsic lack. In other words, something which is in potential is lacking, more pogum, more lacking than that which is moving. In other words, if a person doesn't understand nature, he won't understand that there's an intrinsic disability, intrinsic lack in something which is what? Which is resting. Because once it moves, that means that the action or the movement was only potential, and potential is an inherent lack in something. In other words, there must have been, or I guess perhaps, in other words, there must have been an understanding of the world that somehow things which are in a one state, are much more complete. And when they move, perhaps they're less complete. The Rambam is saying exactly the opposite. Something which moves expresses the fact that the movement, the kinetic energy existed in potential, and that's a lack. It's only potential, not an active. Basically, he's saying is that if you're an Amaoritz in physics, then you're an Amaoritz in theology, and that basically has to do with really, in fact, what we spoke about in the previous parak, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu showed Moshe Rabbeinu the entirety of the natural world. It's only by a deep understanding of the natural world can a person first understand the incommensurability, the ability of God to the world, and then he could have the true negative theological conception of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, something that's moving also has a chisaron. What's a lack? Right? Because the lack is that there's something that imparted motion to him, and he doesn't have that. In other words, if I impart motion to an object, so that object which moves only by virtue that something else imparted motion to him. If something else imparted motion to him, and that thing that imparted the motion is not the thing itself, so the thing that moves is ipso facto lacking in that which imparted motion to it. So motion in God is also a lack. In other words, even if he knows them in general, he doesn't know the details, right? So therefore, he'll be missing this analysis, and therefore he won't be able to fully understand what you can apply to God. In other words, if a person understands physics thoroughly, he will not know how to speak about God. In other words, only a proper knowledge of the physical world will allow a person to negate, descriptions of God. If a person is missing some physical aspect of the physical world, he might think he can describe that to God. In other words, a person might think that objects somehow cannot move in some type of rectilinear motion. So he might say, okay, so God can move in rectilinear motion. In other words, or for example, a person might think that something, cannot be 20 billion yards long. So I think God is 20 billion yards long. In other words, unless a person understands, understands theoretically that there is a concept, of length, which, length is always in other words, if you can think of length, that means it's a property of the physical world. So therefore, if it's a factor, I can ascribe it to God. Okay, that's what Rambam is saying. Okay, in other words, which is very interesting, because I think this is actually a statement of Rav Kook. Rav Kook says that the more we know about science, the further up we push our monotheistic concept of God. Because the more we get into the kishkas of nature, the more we get into the underlying aspects of nature, we understand what God is not. In other words, knowing what nature is, the more we know what nature is, allows us to understand more what God is not. So that's a more complete and pure negative theology.
It's like the God of the gaps, but pushed to an extreme.
Right, okay, fine. Right.
If anything science doesn't know, we can put God over there. So
right.
The more we
know
about science, the less room we have for
Right,
God.
I always give the example, it used to be that, people used to associate, like disorder is godliness. And the more that we understand, let's say, at the quantum mechanics, that there's order and disorder and randomness, so therefore we know that God cannot be quantum mechanics. With the property of nature. In other words, the more disorderliness, chaos can be a property of nature. So, in so much a property of nature, we understand that, what's God in a certain sense is above you in that concept too. In other words, I can think of God as being indeterministic.
I cannot.
I could think of it as being indeterminate. Potentially, I could say that nature is deterministic. That's Teva, Elokim. Come on, every drush on Chanukah. Determinism. Rabbi Yitzchak Maran Bala Pachad Yitzchak says that basically Greeks is Teva, that's Hechrech, and Torah is Chayfesh, free will. Okay? Well, once I have a concept of free will, which also can be described, I just can't see everything that appears to be random or chaos, I associate with a Kadosh Baruch Hu. Because I think that's what he's saying. Okay, now, after I've given this introduction, I'm going to bring another parak. In other words, he's going to say what is absurd about those people who believe that one can describe God in certain ways. And this can only be after a person has understood logic and the nature of the natural world. It's very, very interesting that the Rambam in this Hakdama, his introduction, says explicitly that one can only know about metaphysics once a person knows physics. In fact, actually, the order of the Rambam in his Psicha is that first there's logic, then there's physics, and then after that there's metaphysics. And the Rambam says explicitly that, in fact, I'm referring to page 14 in the Schwartz edition, Chochmas Eloikis, in other words, knowledge of God, divine knowledge. I'm on page 14 at the last 3 lines of the first paragraph. Einu museges ela la'acha chochmas hateva, can only be ascertained after a person understands physics, the natural law. Shekain chochmas hateva gabelis b'chochmas aloikis v'kabel b'zman ha'ira. In other words, chochmas hateva precedes, right, chochmas aloikis. So what the Rambam says before a person understands metaphysics, a person understands physics. So you might ask the question, why do I have to understand physics or metaphysics? Let's go right to God. The answer is no. God, in other words, to avoid paganism, God can only be that which nature isn't. If I don't know what nature is, I can ipso facto never know what God isn't. In other words, only after understanding Chochmas HaTeva, understanding thoroughly natural law, what things are, can I understand what God isn't, and therefore that's called metaphysics, divine knowledge. So in other words, that's what the Rambam is really repeating himself here. So the fact is that, in other words, the concept of monotheism can only come about after a person has a clear scientific knowledge of the natural world. Otherwise, there might be something that's unaware of the natural world, and they might decide to identify that with God. And that's what the Rambam is saying, okay? Okay, now, we're going to go to Perek Nun Vav. Perek Nun Vav is a very important chapter, and here the Rambam is actually going to go a little bit further and understand the notion of negative theology in a much more abstract level. What the Rambam is actually doing is he's taking negative theology and bringing it to higher and higher levels, right? Evidently in the time of the Rambam there was probably nobody that understood that Kadosh Baruch Hu was a physical being. I'm sure most people by that time had abandoned that. However, there might have been people who believed in some type of a description of God which didn't involve a physical description, but you would probably call, I don't want to call it a metaphysical description, but a description that's not overtly physical. The Rambam is going to come along and tell us how even these apparently non-physical descriptions of gods are also, in fact, to be dismissed as violations of, the monotheistic and negative theological concept of God. And that's what he's going to do in Perek Nun Vav.
So first he's knocking out the Christians, then he's moving on to the Muslims.
Probably. Or the Kalam.
Which are Muslims?
Yeah, right. Actually, according to the Rambam, I think the Kalam in Perek Ayin Beis, the Rambam says that Kalam began with Christianity and then with the Muslims.
But the Muslims got it when they debated the Christians.
Yeah, right. That's why you can't debate people with wrong hashkafas. They'll just pick it up and expound upon it. Okay, fine. So much for interfaith debate. Ecumenicism. Okay, fine. Now, Perek Nun Vav. Okay, now. I'm on page 137, Perek Nun Vav. We're moving along, because actually these programs have to be understood together, and after that we're going to actually come to some very, very interesting insights into the Rambam and his concept of God. Da, shadamius yachas ben shnei devorim. In other words, comparing things is a connection, a relationship between two things. In other words, when I compare two things, what I'm doing is, when I compare things, what I do is I connect. There's a relationship between two things. In other words, a comparison can only come as a relationship between two things. If there's no relationship between two things, you cannot compare them. It's interesting, I'm saying compare them, it's a relationship comparison. In other words, damyus I'm saying is a comparison. Or I was like this, maybe damyus should be an analogy. In other words, dasha damyus, analogy, is, an analogy comes from a relationship between two things. All analogies, commensurability would be the best term, I think analogy is fine. In other words, any analogy is always rooted in comparing two things which are alike. But if there's no, in other words, so the Rambam says, if two things have no connection with each other, so you cannot make an analogy. Similarly, two things which have no analogy, it must be that what? It must be that there's no connection. Yachas means connection. For example, we don't say, we don't say this heat is similar to this color. Well, you can't make an analogy between heat and color. So like you can't say that this voice is similar to this sweet thing, the sweetness of this thing, the taste of this thing. So this is partial. In other words, you can't take two things which have no connection with each other and make analogies between them on any level. So therefore, since there's no connection between us and God, there can't be analogies. In other words, you can't make analogous statements about God. Which means, actually, I think what the Rambam really means, probably means we'll see, you can't even use a term, you know what, you can't, there's no analogy, there's no logical analogy that you make between God and anything else, because there's no connection between God and everything else. Da, says the Rambam, shekol shnei devorim hashayachim lebein echad, kavanasi shemo shneim hi achas, ela shehem shoynim begol v'koyten, or v'chotz v'chulshon, kids behem, right? In other words, two things that are part of the same group, paradigm set, right? Even though they might have different characteristics, one could be big, one could be small, one could be strong, one could be weak, right? So therefore, right, they're obviously similar to each other, right? Even though they might appear differently, they have a similarity, something in common. For example, he says a little mustard seed, and I guess a type of comet, right? What do they have in common? 3 dimensions. They're 3-dimensional. Interesting. I thought the Rambam thought that the planets are 2, whatever it is. It's very sarachiyun here. Even though one is small, one is bigger. But both of them have the same dimensionality. In other words, basically, wax, which melts in the sun, and the yisoida eish, the element of fire, right, are similar to each other. Why? Because they have a property. They have heat as a property. Even though wax which is melted, right, is different than fire. And basically, but the heat is what they have in common. Okay, now, so it says that I'm like this. Kach roy, therefore it is fitting to assert, to believe. Right? If a person believed that we couldn't describe God in any way, if we believe that God's essence can be described, right, in any way, right, and that, right, and that is that what? Nimtza means he exists, Chai, he's alive, Yochel means he can, Yodea v'roitze, he knows that he wants, She'ein yachas and yonam ha'elei lav ha'ilin b'ashbos achas. So the Rambam is something like this. What's the Rambam getting at? We do speak about that God exists. The Rambam proves that God exists. We do speak about God's ratzon, his will. We speak about God's knowledge. But says the Rambam, right? Since there's no Yah's connection between us and God, so it must be that when we're speaking these words have a different meaning. They don't mean the same thing. In other words, people might think that our knowledge is like God's knowledge, but what? God knows more. Or for example, God lives like we live, but God lives longer. Or God is...
But they are analogous.
What?
But there's an analogy.
No, he's going to say not. He's going to say not.
The thing is, but if you take the example of wax and fire...
No, because those are things that have something in common. In other words, those things have in common. But in other words, God is stronger than us, says the Rambam. So people think, right, is that when we speak about God's knowledge, it's like an analogy to man's knowledge. In other words, why would people think like that? Because if I use the same word, it means I'm making an analogy between two things. I must have something in common. Says the Rambam, Ein hadava kach b'shabayfet. There is no way that this is true. Absolutely not true. Ki l'shoin yosabin, when you say more, God knows more, God lives more, God does things more. In other words, it's two things which really have something in common. And you compare them, but it's not true. Okay? So in other words, says the Rambam, even though we might use terms like existence and knowledge in God, they have absolutely no meaning in common with when we say a person knows something. Well, the feast of Rosh Hashanah Torah Atzmos, Harei Kamosh B'Schayv Atzmos Yis Al Loited Milan Atzmos, Kach B'Chayv Shetorah Atzmos Shaloi, Hashem Toim Lahem, Lo Yidbu L'Torem V'Agdora Etzchas Lo Techlo Loisam. Achim Ein Moisim Kach El Achoshvim She'Agdora Achas Koleres Oisam V'She'ein Dam Yis Hadas B'Neiam. Achavar is Bar L'Misha Veiz L'Shmashmos Hadam Yis Hadadis, Shalom Yis Allah V'Kol Ma Shulas Nimtza Nimtza B'Shita Kabel Bovat. It was basically like that. Let's go back again. The Rambam is saying the following thing. Right? According to their opinion, these people believe that you cannot ascribe a description of God. You can't describe God. Right? Right? But basically they can't be exactly the same. In other words, really, when they speak about God's attributes, really they shouldn't be saying that what? Yeah, but the two things have nothing in common. The words are being used differently. Because they don't do like this. They want to say the two things, even though they want to say that even though they're not alike, they have the same meaning, the same understanding. When we say God exists, right? It's just the same. It's just a common word. But when we say God exists and a person exists, they have nothing to do with each other. It's just a common word. We use the same word, exist. Okay? Now, what I want to do is, right, that basically what the Rambam is trying to say is the contention. Sometimes, the Rambam himself is going to say, what the Rambam later on in 68 and 69, in chapter 68 and 69, Samach Tes, is actually going to make the contention that what? That actually God knows. You can speak about God knowing, God's ratzon, His will, but God's knowledge is completely different than our type of knowledge. To give an example, the Rambam, in several places, but I think probably the most famous place, at least if Yeshivish, is in Parakeh in Hilchos Tshuva. There the Rambam raises the following, the famous question. He raises several places in his in his writings, how can we say that man has free will if God has absolute knowledge? That's the Rambam's question. In other words, it says the Ram, the very end of Parakeh, how can we claim that man has free will? And free will is very, very important in the Rambam. Otherwise, there's no point to mitzvahs and Torah and ethics in any way. How can we claim that man has free will? In fact, God has knowledge of all of his actions. That denies free will. Says the Rambam, to say, when we say God knows something, it means something totally different than when we say man knows something. In other words, the statement God knows something has no meaning. Has no meaning for us.
He gives that answer there also?
No, that's the answer he gives. When he says that, for God, the knower, the object of knowledge, the object of knowing are one and the same.
Hilchos Tshuva.
Hilchos Tshuva. And Shimon HaProkim, I think he gives the same answer in all places. In other words, basically what the Rambam is saying is, it's not a question. Because the question between free will and knowledge is based upon our concept of knowledge. If I know you're going to do something, I'm sure you don't have free will, because I know you're going to do it. But God's kind of knowledge is totally different. God's knowledge is different. We can't say God knows something, that you're going to do it, because we can't use God's knowledge as we use we say a person has a knowledge. So in other words, the Rambam understands clearly, and the Rambam is actually going to speak about the Moreh Nevuchim. In Chedek Gimel, I think, Parak Yudches, Yutes, Chaf Aleph, the Rambam raised the question, how could it be, right, says the Rambam, how could it be that, that if we believe that a person is rewarded only for doing mitzvahs, God's will, and is punished only for doing averos, how does it be that tzaddikim seem to suffer? Says the Rambam, God's knowledge is incomparable with your knowledge. His knowledge is totally infinite. With the Rambam almost makes God's knowledge like it makes God's essence himself. Just like God's essence is totally other than who you are and anything else, so is God's knowledge too. Okay, in other words, this is an important thing. Okay, now, what I want to do is that all of these
Well, now, what do we make of the proof of the existence of God that he gives?
We'll get to it right now. I know what you're speaking about, right, Jasper? And first of all, I brought your book on the ontological argument, and we're going to speak about that. That's what we're getting into right now. In other words, these two chapters are actually introductions to what the Rambam wants to really speak about. And in Parak Nun Zayin, page 139, the Rambam says, Ala ta'arim, on attributes, Amuk Yaisa, much deeper, Mimasha Kadam. The Rambam's going to go deeper into it. Because up to now, I wouldn't say it's negative theology for dummies, but in other words, the Rambam has said things which we more or less can understand. But now the Rambam's going to go deeper. Because the Rambam now is going to explain a little bit why is it that there are certain things which have no meaning for us. In other words, why is it about certain terms that we can say that in a certain sense, when the term is applied to God, it has no meaning for us. That's what I'm going to speak about here. And he's going to speak about existence. Okay? Okay, very good. Now we'll begin on page 139, and this is really what I want to get into, because really, this is the crucial chapter of the Rambam. The Rambam has now brought the cosmological theology to a very abstract level. We've defined it, not only in terms of physical descriptions, but in terms of motion or acts, in terms of absence, and in terms of analogy, and now we're going to go actually a bit deeper. You see, the important thing here is that you just can see about negative theology will be quiet. I mean, we do speak about God knowing things. God knowing things is very, very important. Not only do Psukim suggest that, but actually God knowledge is very important. There cannot be schava onish, there cannot be, reward and punishment without God's knowledge. There cannot be commands without God's rotza and God's will. In other words, there has to be a way in which we speak about God. Otherwise, there's no point in relating to God. So how do we speak about God and not be confused with what we would call a description of God? So comes the Rambam is going to give us a little bit of an understanding how we use terms which apply to God, but how we're supposed to think of them. That's the Rambam's going to begin over here. Says the Rambam, Yadua, it is well known, Shametzius, hi irua she'ira l'nemtza. In other words, existence is not an intrinsic property of something, but it's a predicate. It might be true, it might not be true. In other words, it's a statement of a certain fact, which either can be true or not be true. In other words, existence is separate from the essence of what something is. In other words, the essence of what something is can never change. But it might exist, it might not exist. In other words, the essence of a tree will never change. The tree is a tree. But the tree either might exist or might not exist. In other words, the existence of a tree is a coincidence. It might exist, it might not exist. But it has nothing to do with what a tree is. Says the Rambam, in other words, basically, this is a very basic fact, says the Rambam, which is related to the fact that everything has to have a cause for its existence. Which means that what? Something's existence comes from outside of it. Something creates it or doesn't create it. Someone brings it about, doesn't bring it about. But nonetheless, mitzius, existence, the predicate of existence, is something which is an addition, is separate from its essence. Okay? Now, let's go to page 140. Okay, like this. Once again. Why is my existence separate from my essence? Because that which gives me existence, that which the cause of my existence, is something outside of me. In other words, I can't do anything about my existence. Either I was caused to exist or wasn't caused to exist. No one's born by himself. His parents give birth to him, or however they give birth these days. Now, says the Rambam, because of this, on page 140, but if there's no cause for my existence, now who's the person? Who's that thing? Who is that? Who is he? That there's nothing other than he that's the cause for his existence. Well, obviously, if Huakel Yisal Levadi, that's a Kadosh Baruch Hu. Ki zoy za mashmo shel abiraseinu al oidosav Yisal Shu b'chuyev hametzius. Right? In other words, when we say Kadosh Baruch Hu is of necessary existence, b'chuyev hametzius, what do we mean? We mean that nothing can be the cause for God's existence. God's the source of his own existence. Bari, so that's clear. In other words, God's existence is part of his essence. In other words, my existence is a predicate and not part of my essence, only because my existence is contingent upon something else, which causes me to exist. Since the Kadosh Baruch Hu, God, does not have anything other than him causing him to exist, because of this, his existence comes from him. It's part of what he is. His existence is part of his essence. V'amisusa, that was the truth of God, is the truth of his existence. V'atzbusu mitziusa. In other words, his essence is his existence. God and existence are one and the same. Ein za'atzbush iwa lo shigil l'dei mitzius. She'az mitziusu haisa inyan anoisef alev. She'u mechuya mitzius tamid. She'ein miskadish loy davar lefetav loy mis'ara loy iwa. In other words, when we say God's existence is his essence, we're not speaking about that. We're not speaking about his essence as something that happens to exist. That existence is in other words, it's an event, it's an occurrence. But rather, in other words, God always has to exist. It's impossible that God doesn't exist. There can't ever be a time that God doesn't exist. In other words, we can't even contemplate. Well, I mean, there's no such thing as God not existing. He has to exist. Just as he has to be God, he has to exist. There's no difference between the two. If the difference between God and existence, so existence is something extra, and I can say that God perhaps doesn't exist. That can't be. God has to exist. Now, says the Rambam, goes on the Rambam, says, in other words, God exists. Right? Right? But he doesn't exist because, in other words, God exists, but not because of existence. There was no such thing as existence other than God that caused God to exist. There was existence is not a category. The category of things which exists, of which God is part of. In other words, God does not have to be included in the category of existence. In other words, there's the null set, and there's and sets which are which have a member. God is not part of those things which exist. Because then you would have to say that God's existence is contingent on a more general idea of existence, which includes God. That's not true. Because God exists, but not because of the definition of existence. He's also alive. But not because there's a concept of life other than God, to which God happens to meet the criteria of that life. In other words, God doesn't happen to meet the criterion of existence. His existence is part of who he is. God is not alive because he meets the criterion of life. It's part of who he is. God doesn't know because he happens to meet the criteria of what is to have knowledge. In other words, God's existence, his knowledge, his yecholos, his will, are not because there's a concept called will and it checks and we can check into God. His will is a part of who he is. Okay, now.
My will's not part of who I am?
What?
My will's not part of who I am?
Your will might be intrinsic into you, but I have a definition of will. In other words, for example, when I see that you want something, so I say, well, there's something called will, and that's exhibited by a certain behavior, and you, in other words, since you exhibited this behavior, therefore you must will. You know something. What do you mean you know something? Because I give you a test. How do I know you know something? I give you a test. You fill out the things, you get a good mark on it. Now, why? The test is the criterion by which a person knows. You satisfy those things, and therefore you know. Only when I give you the test do I know what you know. Which means the possibility to get the test you don't know. You can't say that about God. There's no God test you give to God. Not a knowledge test, and not an existence test, and not a will test, and not anything which is part of his essence. I know this is very difficult to conceive, but it's very, very important for us to understand this. Okay? Now, it's very interesting, right? It's very interesting that how does the Rambam begin the parak? How does it begin the chapter? The Rambam proves that why is it that God's existence is part of God? Because a thing's existence is usually because there's a reason for its existence. A siba, a reason. In other words, things usually exist because there's something other than them that's responsible for their existence. Since there's no siba, something which is responsible for God, no one created God, nothing caused God to exist, right? So because of that, in other words, we can't say that God's, in other words, something's existence is a predicate because it's an outside thing which caused it to exist. Since we can't say something about God, so therefore, because of that, right, we can't say God's existence is a predicate, which means like this. According to the Rambam, I think this is very, very important too, the bottom line is, I can't say something else affects God. And in fact, actually, this was a theme we spoke about in actually Perek Nun Hey. In other words, why can't you say God moves? Because something has to impart movement. Nothing can affect God. Why can't you say God lacks something? Because something must have given the thing that he lacks. In other words, all these definitions, these divine qualities, ultimately come from what you would say is the fundamental quality that nothing can affect God. God is a creator. And that, in fact, makes sense in terms of how the Rambam proves God. If you look at Chelik Beis in the Rambam, beginning of Chelik Beis, there the Rambam has proofs of God. The proofs of God are, I think, what's called cosmological. Namely, they're proofs that the world must have been created by something, and that thing could not be created by something else. In other words, the Rambam is, I'm going to say, going to Shitasa. In other words, like this, once I prove God through a cosmological argument, means a creationist argument. In other words, God is the creator and therefore cannot be created. That's the way I know there's a God. How do I know there's a God? I know the world has a creator. Right? Yesh. Baal Abira. Avram Avinu. I know there's a God because I know that God created the world and he cannot have been created. So, the basic way I know, I'm informed about God is creation. God is the Siba, Kol HaSibos. The reason for every other reason. The reason for everything. But he himself is not preceded by a reason before him. So since I know that, so I know that for sure, existence cannot be what? an attribute which is a predicate of God, which not be, because nothing can impart existence to God. Therefore, his existence comes from God as part of God himself. And I think the same thing would apply to his attributes too, for Ratzon. Since nothing can impart the Ratzon to God, nothing can impart knowledge to God, so therefore it must be part of God. In other words, all these divine attributes or predicates, derive from a more fundamental predicate, which comes from what's called determinism, imparting creation, cosmological. Now, what's interesting is that there are two famous types of proofs of God. I mean, there are other proofs of God. But the two famous proofs of God are what's called the cosmological proof and the ontological proof. Right?
Well, there's teleological proof too.
I find there's others, historical proof, whatever it is. I don't want to go into all the key proofs. I'm just basically going. I want to stick with I want to stick with whatever it is. I want to stick with the let's stick with how can I say the more important proofs right now. Now what Saint wait a minute Saint Anselm lived when? Before the Rambam or after the Rambam?
Before the Rambam.
I forgot. 12th century maybe?
So that's around the time of the Rambam. I don't think the Rambam knew about him.
11th century maybe? Between 11th and 13th, I don't remember.
1 second. I think I had this book on the ontological proof. It better tell me when he lived. Oh boy. Why did I... 1 second. Just excuse me. Let's see. When did he live? Yeah, get that book and see when he lived. Oh, 1 second. Yeah.
He lived in the beginning of the 12th century.
I think Rambam too, right?
Maybe the 11th, yeah.
Yeah, I think the Rambam too is around the, right? Around the same time.
What generation before Rambam?
What?
Generation before Rambam.
Right before the Rambam, right? The fact is we find one of the basic issues that's asked by historians, intellectual historians, is that even though the ontological proof, we're going to speak about the ontological proof first. Don't worry, listeners. I'm not going to leave you in the dark here. Even though the ontological proof of Anselm was, he figured it out, I think, in the 12th century, in the 11th century, it didn't become popular until about like the 17th century, until Descartes. In other words, throughout the Middle Ages, we don't see that the medieval philosophers, either Jewish nor Christian or Muslim, actually use what's called an ontological proof. Right? That's another proof, right?
Some Muslim philosophers use it a little bit.
Maybe, but not certainly. We don't see it in the. I don't think we see it in the Rishonim. Certainly, whatever it is. In other words, and actually, Amos Funkenstein of the book Theology and Scientific Imagination also points this out, that we don't see the medieval philosophers actually, in fact, use an ontological proof, which means the medieval philosophers use cosmological proofs mostly. Creation, but that's the Rambam does. The Rambam uses creation of proofs, even though there is one proof in the Rambam which could be construed as an ontological proof, we'll see a little bit later. But Rambam actually gives us several proofs. But the main proofs are certainly cosmological, Aristotle's cosmological proof. Now, what's called ontological proofs, that means the proofs of God's existence, which we'll speak about in a little while, right? We don't see this in the Middle Ages. The question is why? Why don't we see it? So, I want to quote from... this is a book which I've actually... When did I use this? I've used this book a few times, right? The book by Amos Funkenstein, Theology and Scientific Imagination, the Middle Ages of the 17th Century, Princeton University Press, 1986. It's a good book. He's actually... he's a Yid, and he knows things, knows Rishonim, he knows in all the Latin. So, he actually raises these questions. He says... I'm reading on page 25. Right? This is the book?
Thank you.
Okay. It's a nice book. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, that was terrible. This.
You move it closer. Yeah, still can't see it.
Okay, very good. Okay. It's an excellent book. Now, I picked this up in a used book first, and it was very good. I'm really very happy I did this. Now, why was Anselm's ontological proof neglected in many quarters of the Middle Ages, and why was it so widely claimed in the 17th century? 17th century already, it comes about. Akadekach, that, the Gedolim of the 18th century speak about it. Okay, Wolf, I think even Mendelssohn speaks about it, even though I think Mendelssohn didn't like it so much, whatever. If successful, it proves God's existence by demonstrating that an adequate notion of God excludes of necessity non-existence. In other words, the concept of God means that he has to exist. Yet many medieval theologians deny that we possess a notion of God adequate to sustain the ontological argument without watering it down. God, according to Thomas, is indeed a notum per si ipsum, but only to himself, not to us. Descartes, Moreh, Leibniz, and Wolff revive the argument because they believe that claim to form an adequate, precise, and incomplete idea of God. Very interesting like this. The ontological proof requires a person to have a certain really clear concept of what God is. I mean, it doesn't have to be totally what God is, but you have a clear concept of God. It can't be foggy. In other words, Descartes tried to be very analytic and rational in his understanding of God. God was not something other. God is something that a person actually can, in a certain sense, intellectually chew on. He can try to analyze it. So, because of that, the concept of God can be shown to necessarily, imply his existence. On the other hand, medieval philosophers, that would include the Rambam too, who understood you can't speak about God. You really can't speak about God. You can't speak about him at all, right? So you can't speak about him. So you can't go from the concept of God to his existence, because we don't have a clear notion of the concept of God. In other words, basically, the more we know about God, or if we have a clear concept of God is, so we can speak about the concept of God as implying his existence. You can't prove things about God, though, if you have no notion of what God is. You can prove he created the world, but that's about it. Now, what's interesting is that the Rambam here, in my opinion, seems to be saying that God's messiah, his existence, we can't speak about God's existence in the way we understand existence. So this would deny the possibility of an ontological proof. Because when I prove God exists, the statement God exists doesn't mean the same thing as I exist. In other words, I can't prove God exists in the sense that you exist, because when I say God exists, it has a totally different meaning. So by definition, the Rambam here is blocking out the possibility of an ontological proof. That's what I would say. Now, but I want to go this a little deeper, because the fact is that there's a famous argument of Kant, the German philosopher Kant, who wants to claim that the ontological proof and the cosmological truth are really one and the same. Each assumes the other. And
ontological and cosmological.
And cosmological proof. Which means that once I wipe out one, I wipe out the other. Because it's really the same, no?
Only one direction. The cosmological proof
implies the ontological proof.
Presupposes the
ontological proof. In other words, which means that it would come out, according to this,
you can't have a cosmological without ontological.
Right, which means that would blow up the Rambam. Because the Rambam can't have an ontological proof, it can't have a cosmological proof.
No.
In other words, it's Kant versus Maimonides. Who's going to win? We all know that it's all fixed anyway, but whatever it is. But that's, to me, a very, very important thing. In other words, according to Kant, the cosmological proof presumes, or the cosmological proof presumes the ontological proof. According to the Rambam, as I've proven to you now, it's impossible to have an ontological proof, because I can't speak about God in any other way. Therefore, I can't have a cosmological proof. Therefore, the Rambam could possibly cannot have proved God exists through a cosmological argument, which means that blows away section 2 of the Rambam, Chas v'Shalom. So therefore, what we have to do, and this we're going to do mitzvah next time, because we're running out of time, we're going to actually go deeply into the ontological proof. I'll have to do it a little bit. And then we'll take an examination of Kant's argument, see if we can puncture it, and then after that we'll be able to resuscitate the Rambam, the Ezer Hashem, from an undisclosed location in Yerushalayim till the next lecture.